This is a Roqe Media series, The Contemporary History of Iran, Part 8. Hi there, and welcome to the Contemporary History of Iran, a series from Roqe Media. This is Part 8, the Shiraz Festival Complexities. I'm Jian Ghomeshi. Our aim with this series is to explore the events, personalities, and issues that have shaped modern Iran. We want to do this as much as possible through a non-traditional lens, through snapshots of change, and using alternative voices or angles. This series is mostly in English and will feature a new episode posted every Thursday across our Roqe Media platforms. We will post subtitled excerpts with Farsi Zirnavis on our YouTube and Instagram sites. We are coming to you on roqemedia.com. It is there that you can link to all of our platforms, and we invite you to check out parts 1 through 7 of this series that have already been posted. The Contemporary History of Iran is brought to you in part by Yazdani Law Group. YLG is one of the largest Iranian-Canadian immigration law firms. Their mission, rooted in the leadership of founder Afshin Yazdani, is built on continuously striving to innovate and introduce new immigration pathways for their clients. Afshin began his career as a lawyer and law professor in Iran, and his company has now made it their goal to provide the best, simplest, least risky, and most inexpensive way to immigrate to Canada. YLG has an impressive track record, hundreds of applications from Iran successfully processed every year. They are at YLGPC on Instagram. That is Yazdani Law Group. All right, let's get started. Here now is the Contemporary History of Iran, Part 8. Well, any meditation on the arts and culture of modern Iran in the 20th century would surely have to include the Shiraz Festival of Arts. Even those who are not arts aficionados will likely have heard of an event that has taken on a mythical kind of status as time has passed. The Festival of Arts was an annual international summer arts festival held in Iran in the city of Shiraz and Persepolis from 1967 to 1977. Its overriding stated mission was to be a meeting place of the performing arts of the Eastern world with those of the West. Accompanied by symposia and debates, the festival program included music, dance, drama, and film performed in various locations in Shiraz and surrounding areas. It was an initiative of Shahbanu Farah Pahlavi. But the Festival of Arts became much more than a benign platform for arts and culture. When it launched, there was little precedent for an international arts festival of its kind anywhere in the world. It was lauded for its innovation, but the festival also played a transgressive role, and while it began as a forum for works and performances that were considered radical and socially or politically liberal and controversial, by its final year, the Shiraz Festival itself had become a lightning rod for contested symbolism, decadence, accusations of elitism, ideological debate, boycotts, the monarchy, and the very nature of Iran itself. With the coming of the revolution and Khomeini, the festival was shuttered forever. What was it about the Festival of Arts that has inspired such a paradox of emotions, from nostalgia and pride to controversy and debate? My featured guest today is an Iranian-British art historian, curator, writer, and advisor who's focused his sights on telling the story of the Shiraz Festival of Arts in recent years. Vali Mahlouji is a director of the Kaveh Golestan estate, a member of the Art Dubai Modern Advisory Committee, an independent advisor to the British Museum, and the founder of Archaeology of the Final Decade, a non-profit curatorial platform. Through the AOTFD, Vali has worked with art institutions across the globe, such as Tate Modern, the Smithsonian, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and the Paris Museum of Modern Art. He's been a regular presence as a lecturer at international institutions such as Goldsmiths University, Stanford University, Yale, the Asia House, the Asia Society Museum, and has frequently contributed essays and publications to major institutions around the world. In the last 15 years, Vali has researched and written extensively on the Shiraz Persepolis Festival of the Arts and has become something of a go-to expert on the festival and all of its cultural, economic, and political dimensions. He also has a book coming out about the festival. But first, right now, Vali Mahlouji joins me from London, England today. Hello, sir.
Hello, Gian. Very pleased to be here.
It's very nice to have you on the program. Thank you very much for doing this. It was about 15 years ago, as I understand it, that you started researching, writing, talking about the Shiraz Festival of Arts. You've described what you did as breaking the silence about the festival. This is interesting. I mean, I want to get into all the complexities of what the Shiraz Fest was, but on the face of it, why would an arts festival be shrouded in silence decades after its last run?
Yes, it's the very big central question, both around Shiraz, but also in a larger sense around much of what was severed in 1979, our cultural connections through that fault line. The festival presented itself as one of the most highly contested spaces that I've come across. Its artistic territory, really, despite the passage of almost half a century, remains remarkably contested, especially amongst Iranians. And after the Iranians, amongst intelligentsia in America, which is also very interesting.
Contested meaning that the festival itself was a subject of debate.
The festival became not only a subject of debate, but it was, in a sense, if I want to put it reductively, condemned by various attitudes and cultural positions, but as well as political ones. It sounds ludicrous, but it was, by some people, it was blamed for the very Iranian revolution, as a cause of the Iranian revolution.
I mean, on the face of it, it does sound ludicrous because it's an arts festival. Breaking the silence suggests that it was taboo. Are you saying it was taboo to even talk about the Shiraz Arts Festival until recently?
Yes, I think we can think about it like that, but it's the why that is important, because there was a fatwa against it delivered on the 28th of September 1977. Now that's a year and a half before the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So it's very early, and if you think about it, it's why would a festival of arts, a performance festival that was really around music, dance, drama, and theatre mainly, why would that attract such huge weight to itself, such gravity, that there would be a fatwa by the very Ayatollah Khomeini?
It's remarkable stuff. Let's get into it. I mean, with the stage is set. By the way, I mean, something you've written about parenthetically that I think is really apt and important here as well is that the Shiraz Festival of Arts was something that happened in the moment. It's not like a song or a recording or a piece of art that hangs on the wall or even a building that we can visit and see. It's not tactile. In other words, how do we preserve something special and cultural but ephemeral, an event that is not a tangible art object that can be put inside a museum for us to see? It only becomes about memory and then people telling stories about it, right?
Yes, that's right. There's a lot to be said about that. Many art historians have looked back at the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art, which was set up towards the end of this era in 1977, but also attracted controversy for being the wrong thing at the wrong time, wrong money spent for the wrong reasons. But when we look back, both the state in Iran and also the artistic community in Iran, when we look back, we are very proud and very protective of this space, because it's not only the material object is there, but actually there is material value stored, I don't know, hundreds of millions of dollars stored there. Now, in Shiraz, what interested me was that the object, as you said, was ephemeral. So the art object is what happens in the event. And there are two things about this. One is that there's no monetary value to this, but also that's what made it dangerous then, in fact, because performance is in itself inherent in performance, which is a live act. And the fact that the artistry or the art event is the event itself is potentially highly provocative.
Right. Anything can happen.
Anything can happen. And throughout human history, in fact, performance has been very much for subversion, for the erotic, for purging of anxieties, for unraveling the gods, for turning power over its head. All over the world, performance, inherent in performance, is that kind of subversion.
But I want to get back to the fatwa later in this interview, because it's remarkable stuff. It's to say, I don't even want you people thinking about this. Right? You can't own it. You can't put it in your house. You can't look at it. It's gone. It's an event that happened. I don't even want you talking about it. I mean, this is it's as I say, it is fascinating. Take us back to the beginning of this. Give us some context for how this festival was founded. So, as I understand it, in the final decade of the Shah's reign, Iran increasingly provides a home, you might say, for the flowering of alternative music, electronic music, the avant-garde arts. An officially sponsored arts festival becomes part of this. What did the Shah Banu want to do?
Well, I think the arts festival is like the TMOCA, Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art. The two of them are the international pinnacles of a very vast and expansive cultural program. So state-sponsored museums, festivals, and also archival projects. So we are talking about a very transformative period in that respect, economically as well.
Not to mention National Iranian Radio and Television too, right?
Yes, and the establishment of the National Iranian Radio and Television is really important in the foundation and the formation of the festival, because indeed it wasn't the Ministry of Culture, but it was directly the National Iranian Radio Television that was the sponsor and the creator of the festival, in itself very important. So the NIRT was under the emancipated leadership of Reza Qutbi, and the festival enjoyed a large degree of sort of liberal space, being under the NIRT rather than the Ministry of Culture. It would be the equivalent of the BBC in the UK setting up such a huge international festival.
So let me take this one step at a time. So first of all, curiously, I mean, for me, I hear Shiraz is a cultural place, etc. But it's curious to me that it wasn't in Tehran. It was in Shiraz and amongst the ancient ruins of Persepolis. Why?
Well, actually, diversifying and moving away from Tehran was one of the central ideas of the original conceivers of the festival. Let me also add here that the Shah Banu was the patron of the festival. Many might have found that quite strange, but I live in the UK, and Queen Elizabeth II is a patron of the Edinburgh Festival. I think she stepped down, if I'm not wrong, recently. So the patronage of the Shah Banu created a very particular environment whereby, as some artists, for example, in this case, Bijan Safari, the late Bijan Safari, told me, it was as if one of us had suddenly become queen. So there was suddenly an opening, a direct kind of line of communication to the office of the Shah Banu. And I think we have to credit the Shah Banu as a great and modest facilitator of such huge sort of leaps that led to the production of something like the festival. On the other hand, what I always think is very important is not to undermine the very progressive and very interesting group of practitioners from theater and film and literature who were involved in conceiving these projects. For example, if I name a few, Reza Qutbi himself, as I mentioned, who was the director of the National Radio Television, Farokh Qadfari, who had just come back from Iran, having worked at the Cinémathèque Française, Khojaste Kia, having come from training at the Old Vic in theatre. And beyond them, there are scores of important and interesting people, Dr. Farhat, Dr. Safat, Fauzieh Majd, Bijan Safari, the younger generation like Arbi Ovanessian, who are instrumental in making this, in moving this big machine in the direction that it moved in, which is very important, and we'll talk about that.
But when you say the younger generation, I mean, one of the things I've made this point a couple of times now in this series, especially when we're talking about the cultural initiatives of the 60s, like Kanu and like the Shiraz Festival and the Shah Banu. When you use the analogy of Queen Elizabeth, we think of Queen Elizabeth now in her 90s. These folks, Shah Banu and the folks creating this stuff, were really young at the time, right? I mean, these are people in their 30s or 20s. This is not a top-down sort of initiative of the elders, is it?
Well, absolutely. It is young, but it is also in response to a huge amount of knowledge and experience that is also returning to Iran, which is not only the case of Iran, but a lot of these people we're mentioning have had exposure internationally,
right,
have had training internationally, and they're coming back to serve their country.
I should just mention the flag on the play when we talk about this being an initiative of the Shah Banu, of Queen Farah. This becomes, I mean, depending on your perspective, very problematic or heartbreaking in the sense that it is her very involvement. It is the fact that this is state-sponsored by the Pahlavi dynasty that becomes the problem. It becomes the lightning rod for the Shiraz Festival by the 1970s. So it's ironic that she's at the forefront of spawning something that, and she herself becomes one of its biggest albatrosses, right?
Yes, I think it would be good as Iranians to move beyond the kind of mythologies that we work around individual people. I think the contestation went far beyond the person of the Shah Banu. The religious sort of denunciations, we have to understand them as we look back today, that they condemned the very nature of the performing arts, especially within a modern public context, because Shiraz was actually pushing performance into the street. It wasn't happening at Talar Rudaki. It wasn't happening at the Opera House. So the religious denunciations, we have to understand, they had interest in condemning the art itself, especially when it went public, right? But also, I think the political environment of Iran was very radicalized, and there were dogmatic standoffs after what Iran had gone through, and in the context of the Cold War. And even though we have to pay homage as well to all the poets and writers and a lot of intellectuals who had left-leaning political views, but it is also true, and it's very tragic, I think, that they failed in their dogmatic position to realize, and they didn't realize either the transcendental utopianism or the cosmopolitanism of Shiraz, let alone the fact that it was bringing to the fore mainly artists from Asia and Africa. And it was, in its own way, rising to the demands of a new world and a new world order to reflect a post-colonial moment.
Okay, let me come back to the contested part. Because I jumped ahead. I shouldn't have. I was simply trying to make a point that of course I understand that we should move past the mythology about events in history only being about one person, but in this case, the truth is the Pahlavis were lightning rods, for better or worse. There was a revolution that happens, partly based on the existence of the monarchy, so we cannot really ignore that either. But having said all of that, it is fascinating to me that the foresight or the interest that this group of people have, the folks you've just talked about, the founders of the Shiraz Festival, in saying, we're going to recognize where Iran is. I mean, if not entirely geographically, spiritually, in the middle of East and West. And we're going to try to do something international here. I love this. And I was thinking about how for that moment, this is far ahead of their time. As I understand it, there were two main goals: one, to have local artists share a platform with other cultures, presumably international stars, etc., and two, to expose creative Iranians to the cultural currents of other countries. So, in terms of meeting those goals, how effective was the internationalism of the festival from the get-go?
Interestingly, I think that the success of the festival internationally is reflected in the very fact that internationally, there is very little doubt that the festival was one of the most successful crucibles of artistic creativity that allowed experimentation across cultures and, interculturally. There is very little doubt about that. It's the Iranian sort of political and sociological space that still has struggled. I think that's changed a lot because the breaking of the silence that you mentioned is because in the very beginning, it was very difficult for me to approach people around this project. But now I do see a shift, even amongst the kind of colleagues that I've worked with who have decided to change position, to change tact around this. And this is really coming from the fact that it's true that the Shiraz Festival and the work that the Shahbanu was heading across these different institutions, including the festival, and the incredible input of the Iranian thinkers and artists and historians themselves, was really creating a huge amount of respect internally for Iranian arts. So the amount of work that Shiraz did for emancipating and oxygenating the space in Iran to allow the artists to assume an important social role is undoubtable. And internationally, of course, it did something massive. It managed to create an alliance between Asian and African performers and a very particular set of internationally fluid artists who were escaping the rigidities of their own traditions. And they were the avant-gardes and the experimentalists, the neo-avant-gardes of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, who are not giants in their own rights, in their own cultures, but we have to remember they were very peripheral and marginal at the time in their own spaces, including the great and big Merce Cunningham, for example.
So, just on a grassroots level, thinking about this, as a musician who was in a group myself that very much was a festival kind of band. So I did everything from big Irish festivals in New York to folk festivals to the WOMAD in London or whatever, and any musician listening to this right now, or any artist for that matter who's been involved in an arts festival, knows that theater festivals, book festivals, festivals of authors, it's not necessarily what happens on stage that's the magic, although that exists. It's the cross-pollination. It's what you're doing backstage and meeting folks from around the world, or jamming late at night, or exchanging ideas that fosters all of this new creativity. And so the fact that suddenly this thing lands in the middle of Iran, in the southern part of Iran, that where there's folks coming in from international areas, there's folks coming in from different parts of Iran, and they're all thrown together, it couldn't help but create some kind of creative flowering, right?
Yes, indeed. In fact, speaking to artists like Gordon Muma, for example, in America, the musician, he readily claims that Shiraz was singularly the most interesting space for people like him to visit. Also, I think we can romanticize a bit here. It would be nice to also understand that the performances are happening sometimes under a kind of cosmic galaxy of stars. They're happening across, backdrops of, open plains outside Persepolis with, deep blue skies and these kind of mysterious monumentality of the space itself, the architecture of the space itself, the ruins, and the epicness of it all. Anybody who works in theater, or perhaps in music like yourself, would understand that you can't exchange that for a black box. You can't exchange that for a simple stage. So we have to understand that whilst the use of the space, especially Persepolis, had obvious romantic and nationalistic overtones. This is transparent, but at the same time, there was something extremely magical. And of course, we must understand that a lot of performances were happening in the streets of Shiraz, in the gardens of Shiraz, so it wasn't just Persepolis.
And across art forms too. It's not just a music festival or just a poetry festival or just a theater festival. It's all of those things, right?
Yeah, poetry and painting happened a couple of times in the beginning, but the festival really kind of tightened its definitions and its ethos very beautifully. And it's just it takes a lot to get your head around it.
Yeah,
and I think the big thing to talk about is the courageous optimism with which that energy of the creators of the festival and the programmers of the festival charged ahead, knowing and believing that we can emancipate, we can shake the old tree and expect that the best of the fruits will stay and the what's rotten we can do away with.
Speaking of shaking the old tree and doing something different, this isn't just transplanting the biggest stars from the biggest international cities to do gigs in Shiraz. I mean, the curatorial approach of crossing ideological, political, economic lines. One of the things that blows me away is hearing that over three-quarters of the events were devoted to productions and performers from the developing world. You wouldn't see that today, probably because there wouldn't be enough of an economic incentive. You can't make enough money doing that, But just the idea that somebody said, you know what, we're going to reach beyond Paris and New York. We're going to bring them too, but we're going to make this a space for productions from the developing world. What a beautiful idea.
Yeah, I have always emphasized what you just quoted there, the three quarters, because I wanted to play against this elitism, or even worse, this West toxication, which was very much another label that was aggressively attached to the festival. West toxication, which of course links to a huge amount of political thought that was happening in the 60s and the 70s in Iran, which is a huge area to explore in itself. But actually, that's why I've counted from the 311 events that I counted some few years ago, 60 of them were just Iranian classical and traditional music. Just Iranian classical and traditional music. And the biggest number of performers who performed at Shiraz were Iranians. And the second biggest number of performers, you would never guess where they came from. They were from India. And after that, we have France, the US, and Poland. Oh, this is really interesting to understand that it wasn't so much East and West in an Orientalist construction, but actually there was the Eastern Bloc. So we had performers from all the communist countries coming. And to bring performers from all those countries to the festival in Iran was a huge political endeavor in itself, because you had to go from the Iranian Foreign Service to the Polish Foreign Service, get them to agree to their artists to be allowed to leave their country on an exit visa, probably arrive with some intelligence officer to Iran. So you can imagine the kind of Cold War backdrop across which this festival had to be administered. The administration of the festival in itself, across those political divides, was already a huge endeavor.
Right. When you talk about the programmers being so courageous, it also means they're making decisions where just the very nature of being courageous means you're going to do something that some people are not going to like. And this is where the beginnings of the dissent and the contested nature of, as you've said, of the Shiraz Festival starts to happen. I mean, the programmers, the ideas were unequivocally alternative in terms of my reading of this. The curation was alternative. Nobody's booking the Beatles at their peak here. This is interesting and not all very populist or popular. In fact, there was growing criticism that the tastes of the festival were too avant-garde or elite. Tell me about that desire that the founders and the programmers had to provide a disavowal of the status quo.
It was an optimistic and courageous and emancipated attitude that we need to put ourselves and our cultural and artistic reality as a history and as a geography under strain, or in, let's say, in kind of conflict with itself and with its surrounding in order to find breakthroughs. So any form of breakdown would also produce forms of breakthrough. This already needs a very courageous attitude. But we are talking about a world which has had civil rights movements and gay movements and feminist movements, the Algerian Revolution, 1968 Paris. So we are living in a world of alternatives already, right? So the practitioners in Iran are not living in a bubble away from the real world. They are in contact with an international arena of happenings. So we have to put it both in an international and a national context. But nevertheless, this is why the Ministry of Culture was not, initiator of such a project, because there you would have more traditional ideas, more bureaucracy, and dare I say, a bigger grip from the intelligence services. And I have to also add that the intelligence services, this is really interesting, in spite of the patronage of the Queen, the intelligence services themselves are very, very weary of the Shiraz.
We start to get into all these contradictions, all these paradoxes that exist with Shiraz. I mean, I am really interested in your thesis, your idea that the festival became or was a contested space, as you've termed it. So while it was created, for example, with the blessing of the Pahlavi monarchy, it's giving oxygen to progressive voices that are the very people in Iran at that moment who are steadfastly anti-regime. That's an obvious paradox. How did it play out?
Well, I think the NIRT itself was already a liberal space compared to other spaces. And I think what the kind of research I tend to want to do, or I aim for, is really to not to resolve really the contestations, but to complexify the space of contestation. I prefer to think there is never a monolithic reality. There's never one statement and one narrative. In fact, Iran of today is much more a victim of a kind of totalizing project or a totalitarian idea of what we ought to be. However, a space like the Ministry of Culture would have been under a kind of tighter grip, and it would take individuals like Reza Qutbi, and in fact Shahzad Afshar, also who is married to Reza Qutbi, but she was very important in the festival, especially in these areas of music. People like these people, and Khojasti Kian, Farrokh Ghaffari, and Bijan Safari, these people were very emancipated people, and they could take risks, and those risks were obviously allowed. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't understand that within the state apparatus, the fact that there was weariness would, for example, fuel criticism. The criticisms that would be published in the newspapers were often actually fueled from within the established order. So there was conflict coming or contestation coming at the festival from all directions. And anyway, how can I put it? Who was it? George Bernard Shaw, who said, progress depends on the unreasonable man. So I think the fact that the curators were artists, filmmakers, and theater practitioners already set the scene. They were not managers.
Yeah, I'm trying to digest a lot of what you're saying and try to hear it in sort of simple terms. Although you've said that part of your mission is to complexify things, so I don't know if I'll be successful in trying to simplify this. But I mean, I feel like you eluded the question a little bit. There's a major paradox here, which is that that this is the initiative of the state. The state is a monarchy. It's whether it's an authoritarian monarchy or whatever people want to call it, or a golden monarchy. Then it launches this festival that becomes the incubator or the stage for people who are against the monarchy to do their stuff, right? I mean, that's interesting.
Yeah. So I think the question is, when you say that it's initiated by the monarchy, there's a problem there, because the artists and the theater and filmmakers that I'm talking about, they're not the monarchy.
Right.
No, the festival is not initiated by the monarchy. That's a kind of already wrong footing. The festival is initiated by a group of very emancipated artists with the patronage of the Shah Banu.
But who's it funded by? The state, right?
The national radio and television,
Which is the state.
which is the state,
Right.
but it's not. But it's okay. But all museums are built. I mean,
Exactly. Yeah. No, for sure.
the
I mean,
state,
it's
the
no
state
different
doesn't-
from somebody going on the BBC and saying BBC sucks. We should shut down the BBC. It's also a paradox. The BBC is funded by the government, and it creates that space for people to do that. So I'm simply pointing that out. But it's not irrelevant where that this is state sponsored, because that becomes part of the issue, doesn't it? I mean, by the mid 1970s, international artists begin boycotting the festival. Why? Why were they boycotting the festival?
Well, this is why I think looking at the political sociology of Iran is important, because Iran is in the grips of a kind of a reversal, isn't it? Already from the beginning of the 70s, there's an oil crisis. And before that, there is already the crisis of leftist violence, which in return galvanizes and kind of promotes a very aggressive intelligence service reaction to it. So the people who boycott the festival, they do not boycott it because it has royal patronage. They boycott it precisely because of the political tension in Iran, and they decide to side with those who oppose an autocratic system. Autocratic political system. So the boycott is very particularly linked, specifically linked, not to patronage, but to
An autocratic
repression.
system. What they view as an autocratic
Repression.
system. Right.
Repression.
Right.
Political repression. In fact, Khojeste Kia herself, one of the founding members, she resigns from the festival.
Because of state repression.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that. I mean, that's not. I mean, we know that happened, and so there's going to be left wing or artists who are also activists who are going to say I'm not playing the gig. But I think that's not irrelevant. I mean, that's part of, as you say, the festival is, after a while, seems to be getting it from all sides. It's because of this complex space of paradoxes, an artistically liberated zone within what's perceived as an autocracy by some, a celebrator of Iranian traditions during an era of westernization. I mean, in a way, it was too ambitious, maybe, to try and pull all this off.
Well, I think it was innocently optimistic vision that allowed the festival to be thin on the ground. And what I mean is to allow the performances to happen in public spaces, in nature, in bazaar, Saray Moshir, in streets. Once you open up the art expression in that sense, innocently, into the public realm, you are going to allow all kinds of reactions to it. We don't do that most often.
Yes,
Art
yes.
is saved within the sanctities of concrete buildings and huge monuments, and it's really for the initiated. So the optimism with which Shiraz goes ahead is part of its ethos to break down the barriers, to actually be a people's form of art. We also have to understand that a lot of the artists coming from Asia and Africa are coming from spaces which are small towns and villages.
Yeah.
There are traditional forms that belong to the people, right? So it's a very complicated idea. But let me just say this. If the revolution hadn't happened, this controversy would not have happened around Shiraz.
Oh, really? So, because the controversy is building in and around the contested space is existing in the 1970s before the revolution really catches wind, right? I mean, this is. Do you think that would have ended? It would have. Well, they would have made it past that.
Well, exactly. There were a lot of contestations, right? So there was a radical standoff before the revolution in Iran, for sure. However, the festival was a very, very easy target, because of its emancipated nature, because of its experimental nature, because of the fact that performance in itself is subversive and dangerous in
Yes,
itself,
yes,
and ephemeral. The object doesn't exist, so you can throw any mythology at it
yes,
as you will,
yes.
right? So that's what I'm saying. So it can become as a sort of a weak or a stigmatized object. It becomes a very good vessel for that kind of mythology to endure. That's what I mean if the revolution hadn't happened, meaning that there would be the festival would have evolved in itself. It would have changed, like everything would change. It would have adapted in any ways that it had to, etc. But the severance that happened, and the fact that the fatwa was already bestowed upon the festival, meant that it became a very easy target.
So by the mid 70s, in terms of other folks who've written about the Shiraz Arts Festival, people have written about the fact that it seemed to have lost some of its sheen. There was internal debate about the programming. There was controversy. There were some boycotts. What can you say about where the Shiraz Festival of Arts had gotten to by, say, 75, 76?
I think to answer that question, we have to look at how first it arrived at a high point around 1970, 1971, which is that it went through a kind of maturation whereby it understood very, very quickly and in a kind of very ingenious way that you can't easily put various art forms from various parts of the world produced at various eras on the stage without some kind of a thematic arrangement. So by 1969, the festival came up with this amazing idea of music as percussion and rhythm. And by doing that, they allowed African and Asian performers who were very advanced in especially percussion to produce work on stage which was of such high quality that it could stand for itself. And then this flows over into 1970, where theater and ritual is proposed, again, where you can have archaic and traditional performances. By 1971, a huge production called Orgast is conceived that happens through huge amount of experimentation in Iran itself, across various spaces in the landscape. Now, by 1972, the festival then, I think, it kind of looks at how transmission of knowledge is happening from Asia and Africa to Eastern, Western Europe and America, inviting a lot of the avant-gardes to come and perform next to, for example, Indian Kathakali. So there is a reversal transmission of knowledge where the Europeans and Americans are looking to learn from Zen Buddhism or Indian modes of musical practice. So these huge ideas really kind of come in a way to their natural end, by 1974. And it's not that you can continue to be at that high pitch for a very long time. Indeed, the festival happening for 11 years is extremely rare in itself, because these kind of big ideas happen once or twice in other spaces, other geographies, other countries, and then they couldn't do it again. So I think we have to understand that big ideas like that can't keep reinventing themselves. They can go on with the same momentum, but they can't keep reinventing themselves. And I think by 1973, 74, from within the festival itself, the ideas have already been expressed quite a lot, and a high point has been reached. Now, you mentioned external factors also, like boycotts. That also happens, and that's a big topic in itself, which linked to political attitudes towards Iran and not the festival itself.
What about internal divisions, and is that part of the just losing the momentum that you're talking about?
It's difficult to say from outside, but there was a lot of pressure on the festival, as we said, both from within the state apparatus and from the intelligentsia in Iran. I think a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of dogmatic standoffs, and I think it did affect the spirit of the people who were pushing for that kind of elevated ideals and those kind of utopian ideals, because they were really aspiring towards some kind of utopian model of cultural exchange. And if you're attacked a lot, of course, after a while, it does affect the momentum.
How did the you earlier you talked about the secret police force, right? You talked about Savak, and I said let's come back to it. By the 1970s, how is Savak dealing with the perceived radicalism on stage at the peak of the festival, and how's the festival dealing with Savak?
I think if I'm not wrong, some documents have been released and published back in Tehran around Savak attitudes to the festival. But I think it suffices to understand that the nature of the performances that happened in the festival didn't allow any intelligence service, or in this case Savak, to be able to control what was happening on stage. Merely, even if we consider merely for the fact that these things were not scripted. The nature of the performances that happened often happened without a script. And it was a very different, let's say, experience for Savak that was used to having a play script sitting on their shelf for a few years, and then they would go through with red pen and then deliver it back. So I think we can safely say that the space of the festival did not have censorship in it, and Savak didn't have a hand in it, and that made them quite anxious.
But it's probably, it's quite remarkable, really, that the festival can escape that when we hear of certain artists or activists being, jailed, etc. At that time. It's got to be I guess it was another one of the pressures that the festival was feeling in the 1970s. What was the overarching feeling in the final year of the festival in 1977? Can you describe it? Do you know?
I think in 1977, there is this pig child fire. This performance that happened in 1977, an Hungarian performance, that is what ignited a huge amount of controversy. It's a big topic to get into, but it was a very violent performance in itself, and it was referring to Soviet aggression on Hungary. The group performed partly in the street and partly in a shop, which had a window onto the street. So the stage was divided between what was happening on either side of that glass, and there was only a small number of audience inside the shop. But of course, people passing by could see the performance in the street, and there was a kind of a rocking dance between this soldier and this female actress that was then said to have been outright copulation in the street, intercourse happening in the streets of Shiraz. So this sort of controversy was very much fueled by those who were against the festival. And when you open up the space of art to the street anywhere in the world, including the very day the very city where I live in London, you are dealing with different parameters and different issues. So the festival was thin on the ground in terms of securing itself in safe spaces. But that controversy allowed religious authorities to condemn the festival, to even declare that the Hafiziyeh better be burnt than have another concert performed in it. Right. And it allowed Ayatollah Khomeini to pounce on the situation. But I think it's interesting. Your question actually is really interesting. I haven't thought about it before, but in a way it's kind of the nail in the coffin, right?
Do you think the festival programmers and those running the festival would have known in 1977 that was the last time the Shiraz Festival of Arts is going to be staging performances?
No, not at all, because the 1978 was programmed, and one of the most interesting productions that was going to come was going to be Pina Bausch. Wow. It was programmed, but I think first the Ostandari, the governor of Fars, sort of declared his anxiety around security. And then the festival organizers themselves also decided that security of the international artists, the guests, as well as the audiences, is going to be a big issue. And they decided to postpone it effectively. And that already then rolled into the revolution. And then, in fact, where we come back to the beginning, which is the kind of banning of the festival. It affected many artists' careers. And to date, the archives have been banned, which is where I came in to piece together the puzzle and excavate the archive. And then now I'm looking to digitize it completely so that it can be available, so that actually history can judge for itself. And Gian, what is really interesting around the conversation we've had is to understand that if Shiraz was a space of opening, both for Iranian artists, but also for Iranian artists in dialogue with the world they live in, politically, but also geographically, post-revolution Iran has experienced so much isolation and so much closure. And in a sense, the fact that the festival is blamed for the revolution on the one hand and its material remains banned on the other is really symbolically interesting.
Yeah.
Because it represents emancipation and openness and dialogue and experience beyond your normal experience.
What about decadence? How much was it sort of fairly or unfairly painted with this idea of being decadent or even Western in terms of its decadence?
Well, I think we have to we can safely understand that from a religious perspective, decadence is clearly defined, especially in the Abrahamic religions. The relation between genders, the relation to the body. There are huge restrictions on what that is about, especially in the public sphere. So religiously speaking, there was a very clear idea that the body moving in space is already close to being problematic. I think the complication doesn't come so much from that angle, but it came from what you also mentioned, the West Toxication issues, where the left, the kind of Stalinist left, I think their idea of theater and performance was that it has to happen by the workers for the workers. So it has to happen in factories, it has to happen in the fields. And there are trajectories of theater and performance that do deal with that, of course. And so there was a kind of aesthetic resistance to the festival because they considered it superfluous to dance in the mountains or to perform against the ruins. So the segments of Iranian intelligentsia didn't rise to that. Wow. And I think they were mistaken in that. But also we have to understand that just as the festival very much set out to open a space of performance in Iran, it was very aware that the space of performance was very limited in Iran, and the experience of performance was so limited in Iran. Most of our intelligentsia was galvanized around literature and literary criticism and political thought. And those are the people who were condemning the festival. Dare I say, they knew not much about performance. Even in the intelligentsia, there wasn't as much the experience of performance.
So if we get back to where we started this interview and the breaking the silence and the taboo nature of even talking about the Shiraz Festival of Arts up until recently, I mean, that speaks volumes about how disruptive it was perceived to be, how heretical, how radical. And as we also talked about at the top of the interview, there are pre-revolutionary cultural institutions in Iran, like the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art, that survived, albeit with a very different complexion, albeit with some of the artworks hidden somewhere downstairs, and albeit with a different administration. Would continuing the Shiraz Festival, even after those early years of the fatwa and the let's not have any music, would it simply be impossible given the nature of what it was?
Great question. In the work that I've done, I've placed Shiraz in a kind of a mapping of what was happening in the world. And we have to talk about the African festivals, the first World Festival of Negro Arts, 1966, which happened in Senegal. And there were quite a few Senegalese who came to the Shiraz Festival. There was a link. And the 1969 Pan-African Festival that happened in Algiers. And we can also talk about the Nancy Festival that was in France, but it was a university-based festival, and it was headed by Jacques Lang. And the festival in Belgrade. Of all these festivals, the only one that survives into the 21st century is Belgrade. So it's not to do with Iran or Shiraz or the revolution. in fact, the 11 iterations of the Shiraz Festival is in itself already really extraordinary. And I think the mythologies and the stigmas, and what did you call it? You called it the taboo, has endured in the absence of the object, in the absence of material object left from the festival.
What do you think the greatest lesson we can learn as Iranians from the story of the Shiraz Festival of Arts is?
Aspiration is at the core of the festival. And that in itself is, I think, hugely valuable for an artistic space or a nation to aspire, to be able to aspire, and to have the courage to face contradiction, to face, stuff that it's not aware of from its own past, to be put under strain, to kind of face a new world. Is very valuable. And I think Shiraz really encapsulates aspiration and utopian ideals, the notion of dreaming, that you can dream. And I think, like everything else in life, those positions are deemed dangerous by traditional forces, by conservative values, by conventional cultural values. We are natures of habit. And when we want to break those down, when we want to experiment, like most art forms, as you well know, begin with controversy. Controversy is not new to culture.
It's been enlightening talking to you today. I thank you so much for the time you've taken. You've been archaeologically excavating material archives relating to the festival that have been banned since 1979. Your platform is Archaeology of the Final Decade. It's a fantastic title, too. How, if people are listening to you and want to somehow help out with this, how can they do that?
Well, we're very interested in making the documents available to the public. So we are looking to raise more funds to scan and digitize and make publicly available the entirety of the archive. And this is only one of the projects that we are doing. And in that sense, both making it publicly available, but also recirculating these art histories for the sake of future generations.
Thank you so much for doing this today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Gian. It was great pleasure, and always thought-provoking for myself to go through the material.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Vali Mahlouji, an Iranian-British art historian, curator, writer, and advisor. He has a new book coming out about the Shiraz Festival of Arts. The festival took place in Iran from 1967 to 77. We reached Vali Mahlouji in London, England today. This is full time for the Roqe Media series, The Contemporary History of Iran, Part 8, brought to you, of course, in part by Yazdani Law Group, one of Canada's largest immigration law firms, YLGPC, on Instagram. Please check out our regular editions of Roqe and all things related at roqemedia.com. That's our website, roqemedia.com. Thanks to the amazing team who make Roqe Media happen. Producer Susan, talented Anahita, Super Parisa, Ponta, the artist, the fabulous Gian, Savvy Roham, Aghay Merdad, Captain Reza, and Groovy Shaya. Thank you to all of you out there for supporting us and sharing our content. Please subscribe if you've not done so already. You can find me on Instagram at Jian Ghomeshi. Mizun Bashin.